Somewhere beneath the fields and hillsides of prehistoric Europe, people were building. Not just shelters, not just graves, but entire networks of carved chambers, narrow tunnels, and subterranean rooms that stretched deep into the earth. Some of these spaces could hold hundreds of people. Some connected settlements across distances that make no obvious sense. And some of them, even after decades of careful excavation, still haven't given up their secrets. That's what this video is about. We tend to think of prehistoric people as living on the land, farming it, hunting across it, burying their dead beneath it. But there's another story running underneath that one, literally. Across Europe, from the windswept islands of Scotland to the sun-baked rock of Malta, from the Atlantic coastlines of Ireland to the limestone hills of Central Europe and the Mediterranean shores of Sardinia and Iberia, prehistoric communities were going underground in ways that archaeologists are still working to understand. And here's where it gets interesting, because the phrase underground cities is a little misleading, and that tension is worth sitting with for a moment. Some of these sites genuinely resemble subterranean architecture on a massive scale. Others are networks of tight, crawlspace-sized tunnels that a modern adult can barely squeeze through. Some appear to be places where the living gathered. Others were almost certainly reserved for the dead. Some may have been used for storing food. Others show signs of ritual activity that points towards something far harder to define. Calling all of them underground cities bundles together very different things under one dramatic label, and that's exactly the kind of shortcut that makes this topic simultaneously fascinating and frustrating for serious researchers. So, what were these spaces actually for? That's the central question, and the honest answer is that we don't entirely know. Were they refuges, places to hide during raids or survive harsh winters? Were they ritual zones where communities performed ceremonies tied to death, rebirth, or contact with the underworld? Were they practical storage systems, or perhaps routes of communication between settlements? Could they have served multiple purposes across long stretches of time, meaning different things to different generations? All of these explanations have been proposed. All of them have some evidence behind them. None of them fully accounts for every site. Throughout this video, we're going to move through the evidence carefully. We'll look at what archaeologists have actually found, the physical structures, the artifacts, the human remains, the acoustic properties, the astronomical alignments. We'll separate what the evidence clearly supports from what researchers cautiously infer, and we'll be honest about the zones where interpretation runs out and genuine mystery begins. Because that distinction matters. The internet has no shortage of dramatic claims about these sites, ancient civilizations, hidden knowledge, impossible engineering. Some of that framing makes for compelling content. Almost none of it helps us understand what prehistoric people were actually doing. The real story is more nuanced, and in a lot of ways more strange. There's something genuinely unsettling about the idea that entire worlds existed just beneath the surface of the places where people lived their ordinary lives. That the person walking across a field in Neolithic Orkney or Bronze Age Sardinia might have been walking directly above a carved and constructed space that had taken enormous effort to build. What were they building toward? What did going underground mean to the people who first dug these spaces into existence? Let's start at the beginning and work our way down. Before we go deeper into specific sites, it's worth being precise about what we're actually talking about, because the category of prehistoric underground city is doing a lot of work, and not all of it is honest work. The structures included in this conversation span a genuinely wide range. On one end you have hypogea, the term comes from the Greek for under the earth, which are deliberately carved or excavated chambers, sometimes single rooms and sometimes elaborate multi-level complexes. Malta's Ħal Saflieni Hypogeum is the most famous example, a site with over 30 interconnected chambers cut into the rock across 3 distinct levels, used over a period of roughly 1,000 years. Then there are souterrains, a word that comes from the French for underground, referring to stone-lined or rock-cut passageways that appear widely along the Atlantic fringe of Europe, particularly in Scotland, Ireland, Cornwall and Brittany. Rock-cut chamber systems show up across Sardinia, Iberia, and parts of the Mediterranean, where the local geology made carving directly into soft limestone or volcanic tuff not just possible, but practical. And then there are the Erdstalls, those strange, narrow tunnel networks of Central Europe, mostly concentrated in Bavaria and Austria, that seem to belong to a completely different tradition and still generate some of the most unresolved debate in the field. Each of these types has its own origin story, its own regional distribution, and its own set of archaeological puzzles. Lumping them together under the label of underground cities isn't exactly wrong, but it does compress differences that matter enormously when you're trying to understand what any single site was actually for. The word city is the biggest problem. Cities, in the modern or even the classical sense, imply permanent settlement, population density, economic exchange, governance, and infrastructure. A few of the sites we'll discuss do suggest repeated human presence over long periods of time, with evidence of habitation rather than just occasional use. But most of them don't look like places people lived in any conventional sense. They look like places people went, for specific reasons at specific times, and perhaps under specific social or ritual conditions. The difference between a city and a sacred chamber used periodically for ceremony is significant. Using the same word for both flattens the complexity in a way that serves drama better than it serves understanding. That said, the word city does capture something true about scale. Some of these sites required an extraordinary investment of collective labour. The Hypogeum in Malta involved removing roughly 2,000 tons of rock by hand using antler picks and stone tools across generations of workers who never saw the project completed in their lifetimes. The passage grave complexes of Ireland and Orkney demanded precise astronomical knowledge, engineering skill, and organisational capacity that we associate more easily with later civilizations than with Neolithic farming communities. These weren't casual constructions, they were monumental projects, and the people who built them clearly thought they mattered enough to justify enormous effort. So while city may be the wrong word, small scale or simple certainly aren't the right words either. Now, another distinction that matters: not everything underground is prehistoric. Europe has centuries of underground architecture that postdates the prehistoric period, and it's worth drawing a clean line early. The Romans were enthusiastic builders of underground infrastructure: aqueducts, catacombs, drainage systems, military tunnels. Medieval European towns developed their own traditions of underground cellars, storage passages, and escape routes. Early modern fortifications incorporated elaborate subterranean networks. There's even a long tradition of cave use and artificial cave expansion that continued well into historical periods. None of this is what we're focusing on. The sites in this discussion were constructed before writing, before coinage, before the historical record, as we conventionally define it, which in European terms means roughly before the Bronze Age in most regions, and in some cases extending back into the deep Neolithic, more than 5,000 years ago. That prehistoric framing creates its own methodological challenge, and it's one that honest researchers grapple with openly. When you're comparing a carved chamber in Malta, dated to around 3,600 BCE, with a souterrain passage in Scotland, dated to perhaps 800 BCE, you're not necessarily looking at related phenomena just because they both go underground. 2,500 years is a vast span of human history. The communities that built these structures spoke different languages, practiced different forms of agriculture, organized themselves differently, and almost certainly had different cosmologies and belief systems. Finding patterns across such disparate contexts requires extreme care. A tunnel in Bavaria that looks superficially similar to a passage in Ireland may share almost nothing in terms of function, meaning, or the culture that produced it. The resemblance might be coincidence, or it might reflect some deep continuity in how humans relate to underground space that transcends specific cultural contexts. That second possibility is actually one of the more interesting questions underlying all of this. Because one of the genuinely striking things about prehistoric underground architecture in Europe is how often it appears independently across separate traditions. There's no obvious mechanism by which Neolithic Maltese builders were in direct communication with the communities carving Domus de Janas, meaning houses of the fairies or houses of the witches, into the rock of Sardinia, or with the people constructing chambered tombs in Orkney. The distances are vast, the timeframes don't always align, and the cultures were distinct. And yet, all of them, at various points in their prehistory, made the decision to invest enormous effort in going underground and building something there. The most parsimonious explanation is that there's something about underground space itself, its sensory properties, its association with burial, and therefore with death and memory, its capacity to create controlled environments separated from the ordinary world above, that makes it independently compelling to human communities across cultures. This isn't a mystical claim, it's an observation about human psychology and the physical properties of underground environments. The darkness, the silence or strange acoustics, the constant temperature, the feeling of enclosure and separation. These things mean something to people, and they appear to have meant something to prehistoric people in ways that motivated monumental construction. Some researchers have pointed to the role of altered states of consciousness, whether naturally induced by hypoxia in poorly ventilated spaces or deliberately induced through ritual practices, in shaping how underground chambers were perceived and used. Others focus on the more straightforward practical advantages of underground spaces: temperature stability for food storage, defensibility, shelter from extreme weather. Both explanations have evidence behind them at various sites, and they're not mutually exclusive. A space that was practically useful could also become ritually significant over time. A ritual site might have incorporated practical elements. The methodological challenge, then, is not just comparing different types of structures across different regions and timeframes, but interpreting spaces whose original meaning was never written down and whose surviving evidence, pottery, human remains, carved decoration, animal bones, ash deposits, pollen, doesn't come with explanatory labels. Archaeologists are working from physical traces left by people who couldn't have anticipated that their spaces would still exist thousands of years later, or that strangers would come looking for explanations. What this means for how we should approach the topic is that certainty is mostly off the table. What we have instead is a spectrum of interpretive confidence. Some things the evidence clearly shows: this chamber was used for burial. This tunnel was repeatedly sealed and reopened. This space was decorated with geometric carvings during a specific period. Other things are strong inferences. This site was probably used for seasonal gatherings. This passage seems aligned to a solstice sunrise. And then there are zones of genuine interpretive openness, where the evidence constrains speculation but doesn't eliminate it, and where researchers with equal expertise can reach different conclusions. That's not a failure of archaeology. That's what it looks like to investigate people who lived before writing, using only what they left behind in the earth. And what they left behind in these cases is remarkable enough to keep generating new research, new theories, and new reasons to pay attention. So as we move through these sites from Malta to the Scottish Islands, from the limestone hills of Central Europe to the sun-drenched rock of Sardinia, keep that spectrum of confidence in mind. Some of what we'll cover is well established, some of it is contested. Some of it is genuinely, productively mysterious. And the question of why prehistoric Europeans kept going underground, separately and repeatedly across such different landscapes and such vast stretches of time, is one that still doesn't have a single clean answer. Which is, depending on your temperament, either deeply frustrating or exactly the kind of problem worth spending time on. So the question that naturally follows is, why? Why did so many separate prehistoric communities across such different geographies and timeframes make the decision to go underground at all? And the honest answer is that there probably wasn't a single reason, which is itself part of what makes these sites so difficult to interpret. Start with the practical arguments, because they're the easiest to articulate and have real physical evidence behind them. Underground environments offer something that surface environments in much of Europe emphatically do not: thermal stability. Below a certain depth, The temperature of rock and soil stabilizes to a relatively constant level year-round, typically somewhere between 8 and 12 degrees Celsius across most of temperate Europe. In a world without refrigeration, that's enormously valuable. It keeps food from spoiling in summer heat and from freezing in winter cold. Grain, dairy, meat, root vegetables, all of them store better underground than above it. The presence of food storage vessels at a number of subterranean sites supports this as at least one function. Some researchers have argued that souterrains, in particular those stone-lined passage systems of Atlantic Europe, were primarily agricultural infrastructure, essentially built in cold storage attached to or near farmsteads. The positioning of many Irish souterrains beneath or adjacent to habitation sites and the presence of dairy residues in pottery found inside them lends some support to that interpretation. There's also the question of protection and concealment. Underground spaces are inherently defensible in ways that surface structures aren't. An entrance that requires a person to crouch and move slowly is an entrance that eliminates most tactical advantages an attacker might have. The narrow, winding nature of some of these passages, particularly the Erdstall tunnels of Bavaria, where sections narrow to the point where an adult must literally crawl, has been read by some researchers as deliberate design for defensibility. Whether that interpretation holds up is debated, but the intuition behind it is sound. Controlling movement through a confined space gives an advantage to whoever knows the layout. In periods of social instability, or in regions where raiding and conflict were real threats, that could be a compelling reason to invest in underground architecture. Concealment is a slightly different motive from defense, though they overlap. Something hidden underground isn't just protected from physical attack, it's protected from knowledge. Sacred objects, valuable goods, archives of a kind, the remains of ancestors, all of these are things a community might want to keep literally out of sight and out of reach. The inaccessibility isn't just practical, it's a statement about what belongs to whom, and about what categories of person are permitted access. Several underground sites show evidence of deliberate sealing, entrances blocked with stone, passages backfilled, which suggests that the management of access was a concern, not an afterthought. But the practical explanations, compelling as they are, run into a problem when you look at what was actually found in many of these spaces. You don't carve elaborate curvilinear decoration into rock walls to store grain. You don't align a tunnel entrance to catch the midwinter sunrise because you need somewhere cool to keep dairy products. At multiple sites across prehistoric Europe, underground spaces contain evidence that points emphatically away from purely utilitarian use. Human remains arranged in specific configurations, animal bones that suggest feasting or sacrifice, incised geometric patterns on interior walls, deliberate deposits of objects that appear chosen for symbolic rather than functional reasons. Something else was happening. That something else almost certainly involves the symbolic dimensions of underground space. And here the picture becomes more complex, more speculative, and arguably more interesting. To prehistoric communities that didn't sharply distinguish between the natural world and the social or spiritual world, the Earth itself was probably meaningful in ways that are hard to fully reconstruct. The ground is where seeds disappear and plants emerge. It's where the dead are placed, and in some cosmological frameworks, where they continue to exist or to exercise influence over the living. Across many early agricultural societies worldwide, the Earth, and specifically the interior of the Earth, is associated with fertility, gestation, transformation, and ancestral power. Going underground in this framework isn't just moving to a different physical location. It's crossing a threshold into a different kind of space, one that operates by different rules and connects to different forces. This helps explain why so many prehistoric underground sites are also burial sites, or contain human remains as part of their use pattern. The association between underground space and death, and between death and transformation, seems to have been deeply intuitive to communities across prehistoric Europe. But the relationship between burial and ritual use isn't always straightforward. At some sites, it appears that the underground space was used for communal ritual that incorporated the remains of ancestors as active presences rather than inert deposits. The boundary between a tomb and a temple, in other words, may not have been meaningful in the way it is to us. The dead and the living could occupy the same space, and that co-occupation might have been precisely the point. The sensory experience of being underground adds another layer to this. Darkness in a subterranean chamber isn't just the absence of light. It's a condition that fundamentally alters perception. Deprived of visual information, the brain compensates in ways that can produce unusual mental states. Heightened awareness of sound, sensitivity to touch, susceptibility to what researchers sometimes call entoptic phenomena, the geometric visual patterns generated internally by the nervous system under conditions of sensory deprivation. These are the same kinds of patterns, spirals, zigzags, nested arcs, grids, that appear repeatedly in the rock art found at underground and semi-underground sites across prehistoric Europe. Whether this connection is coincidental or causal is genuinely contested, but it's a question serious researchers take seriously. Acoustics matter too. Underground chambers are not acoustically neutral spaces. Depending on their geometry, they can generate significant reverb, standing waves, and effects that cause sound to seem to come from everywhere at once, or from no identifiable source. Researchers studying archaeoacoustics, the relationship between the acoustic properties of ancient spaces and their use, have documented striking examples of this at several prehistoric underground and megalithic sites. Drumming, chanting, or simply speaking in certain chambers produces effects that would have been startling and perhaps profoundly significant to people who had never encountered built acoustics before. If ritual activity happened underground, which at multiple sites the evidence strongly suggests it did, the acoustic environment wasn't just background. It was part of the experience, shaping what participants felt and perceived in ways that may have reinforced beliefs about what underground space was and what it could do. Add temperature and confined movement to this list of experiential factors, and you begin to see why underground space might have been understood as categorically different from the world above. The constant cool, the physical requirement to move slowly and carefully, the disorientation produced by darkness, the strange behavior of sound, all of these combine to create an environment that almost automatically signals difference, that tells the body and the mind that the ordinary rules are suspended. Whether prehistoric people experienced this as sacred, as liminal, as dangerous, or as something outside our modern categories, we can't say with confidence. But that they responded to it and built elaborate architecture to create and control it seems clear. The more difficult question is whether functions changed over time. There's good reason to think they did. A souterrain that began its life as agricultural cold storage might have accumulated symbolic significance through association with specific events, specific people, or specific generations. A chamber that was initially a burial site might have been repurposed for communal ritual as the immediate memory of the dead faded and they became more abstractly ancestral. Sites that were built for one purpose might have been understood differently by communities that inherited them without knowing their origins. This kind of functional layering over time is archaeologically very difficult to detect because it requires distinguishing between phases of use that may have left similar material evidence. But it's also almost certainly real because it reflects how human communities actually relate to built spaces across generations, not preserving original intentions but continuously reinterpreting what exists. This brings us back to the fundamental methodological problem. Inferring function from architecture alone doesn't work. An underground chamber is a physical thing. It has dimensions, orientation, materials, construction method, associated finds. All of these are data points, but none of them, individually or together, produces unambiguous meaning. The same chamber could have served as a cold store, a ritual space, a refuge, a site of initiation, a tomb, or some combination of all of these at different times or simultaneously. The architecture constrains the possibilities. A space too narrow to stand in probably wasn't used for large communal gatherings, but it doesn't eliminate them. And without written records, without oral tradition that can be reliably traced back to the original builders, the interpretive gap between the physical evidence and the human experience it once contained remains genuinely, stubbornly open. What we can say is that prehistoric Europeans clearly found underground space compelling enough to invest in it, repeatedly, across vast distances and long stretches of time. The question of exactly why keeps changing shape the more closely you look at the individual sites. If any single site forces those questions into sharp focus, it's the Hypogeum of Ħal Saflieni. Carved into the limestone bedrock beneath what is now a residential neighborhood in Paola, Malta, the Hypogeum is arguably the most elaborately engineered prehistoric underground complex in Europe, and possibly the world. It was built, expanded, and used over a period of roughly 1,000 years, beginning around 3,600 BCE and continuing until approximately 2,500 BCE, placing its construction and primary use within the same cultural horizon as Malta's extraordinary surface temples at Egantija, Minajra, and Tarxian. Understanding the Hypogeum means understanding it not in isolation, but as the subterranean expression of a society that was simultaneously building some of the most sophisticated stone architecture anywhere on the planet. The site was discovered accidentally in 1902 when workers excavating cisterns for a new housing development broke through the ceiling of one of its upper chambers. What they revealed, and what subsequent excavation, notably by Father Emmanuel Magri and later Themistocles Zammit, would slowly document, was a three-tiered complex of interconnected chambers, corridors and recesses cut entirely by hand into the living rock, covering an area of roughly 500 square meters and descending to a depth of about 11 meters. The scale of the work is almost difficult to process. This wasn't a natural cave that was modified and occupied. Every chamber, every corridor, every curved surface was carved using tools made of bone, antler, stone, and obsidian, in a period before metal was available to the Maltese temple builders. The labor involved was staggering, and it clearly represented a sustained, multi-generational commitment from an entire community. The three levels of the Hypogeum correspond broadly to different phases of construction and potentially different functions. The uppermost level is generally thought to be the earliest and shows the least elaborate carving, consisting largely of natural cavities that were shaped and extended. The middle level is where the architectural ambition becomes fully apparent. This is where the most carefully finished chambers are found, where corbelled ceilings mimic the construction technique visible in Malta's surface temples, and where carved facades imitate structural elements like trilithon doorways and decorative niches that appear in the above-ground religious architecture. The relationship between the temple architecture above ground and the carved imitations below ground is striking and almost certainly intentional, suggesting that the people who built the Hypogeum understood the underground space as continuous with, or perhaps as a reflection of, the sacred structures at the surface. The lowest level descends further into the rock, and in its deepest recesses reaches spaces that are interpreted as possibly being out of bounds to most visitors, areas that may have been accessible only to specific individuals for specific purposes. The evidence for burial is unambiguous. When the site was excavated, the remains of an estimated 7,000 individuals were recovered from the Hypogeum's chambers, a figure that in itself tells you something about the scale and duration of its use and about its centrality to Maltese prehistoric society. The dead were deposited in the lateral recesses and smaller chambers, and various personal objects, animal bones and ceramic vessels were found alongside them. By any archaeological standard, this was a place of the dead. But the architecture of the Hypogeum resists reduction to a simple funerary function, because several of its chambers show design features that appear oriented toward experience, rather than storage. The most famous of these is the chamber known as the Oracle Room. It's a relatively modest space on the middle level, notable for a roughly oval niche cut into one of its walls at approximately head height. Visitors and researchers have long observed that speaking or chanting into this niche produces a striking acoustic effect, a deep, resonant reverberation that fills the chamber and seems to linger and diffuse in ways that a normal enclosed space wouldn't produce. Studies of the chamber's acoustics, including work by researchers associated with the archaeoacoustics field, have found that the resonant frequency most strongly amplified hovers around 110 Hz, a frequency range corresponding to a low male voice, and that this resonance is consistent and reproducible. Whether this acoustic property was deliberately engineered by the people who carved the chamber, or whether it emerged as a byproduct of the rock type and the room's geometry, is a question that hasn't been definitively resolved. The Maltese limestone is relatively uniform, and the shaping of the room could plausibly have been optimized through trial and experience. What's harder to establish is what the acoustic effect was used for and who was present when it occurred. This is where the documented archaeology and the layers of later interpretation start to diverge, and it's worth being precise about the distinction. The acoustic properties of the oracle room are measurable and real. The carved architecture is extraordinary and deliberate. The human remains are archaeological fact. What is not archaeologically demonstrated is the narrative of elaborate acoustic rituals, of priests manipulating sound to induce altered states in assembled worshippers, of intentional consciousness engineering through carefully calibrated resonance. These ideas circulate widely in popular literature about the Hypogeum, and some of them draw on genuine research in archaeoacoustics, but they've been extended and dramatized well beyond what the evidence actually supports. The site has also attracted a significant amount of fringe speculation. Claims about elongated skulls found in the Hypogeum being evidence of a separate, possibly extraterrestrial population, claims that the deeper levels connect to vast underground networks beneath Malta, claims about lost priests and forbidden knowledge. These require no serious engagement. The problem isn't that the Hypogeum is unexplained, it's that it's so genuinely impressive that imagination tends to run ahead of documentation. What makes the Hypogeum legitimate and enduring as a subject of serious investigation is precisely what makes it difficult to explain within conventional frameworks, not because it requires exotic hypotheses, but because it represents a level of architectural and social complexity that challenges assumptions about what prehistoric communities were capable of organizing. A society without metal tools, without a writing system, on a small island with limited resources, sustained a project of underground construction and use across something like a millennium, producing a multi-level complex that deliberately mirrored its surface temple architecture, incorporated its dead into an active religious landscape, and created an environment designed to feel categorically different from the world above. The acoustic effects, the controlled lighting, the physical experience of moving through its carved corridors toward its deeper chambers, all of this suggests intentional design of an experiential journey, not just the provision of a burial vault. The Hypogeum sits at the center of debates about prehistoric underground worlds precisely because it's the most complete example of what those worlds could look like when a community committed to them fully. Other subterranean sites across Europe offer fragments, partial pictures, isolated chambers. The Hypogeum offers a system, and systems raise the hardest questions because they imply planning, intention, and a level of shared understanding about what the underground was for that we can observe in the architecture but cannot yet fully read. From the extraordinary sophistication of the Hypogeum, we move to something that looks at first glance considerably more modest, and yet proves equally resistant to easy explanation. Spread across Scotland, Ireland, and parts of the broader Atlantic fringe of Europe, there are thousands of structures known as souterrains. The word itself comes from the French for underground, and the basic form is consistent enough. A roughly built underground passage or chamber, often constructed from dry stone walling and covered with large capstones, running beneath or immediately beside a surface settlement. They are, in the most literal sense, rooms beneath rooms, deliberately excavated, deliberately constructed, and deliberately hidden from the landscape above. In Scotland alone, estimates suggest there are somewhere between 500 and 1,000 known souterrains, though the actual number is almost certainly higher given how many remain undiscovered beneath agricultural land. Ireland has produced comparable concentrations, particularly in the north and along the Atlantic coast, with Connaught, Ulster, and parts of Munster showing significant clusters. Brittany in northwestern France has its own tradition of similar structures, and examples turn up in Cornwall, on the Northern Isles, and across the Hebrides. The sheer geographic spread tells you something important. This was not a local tradition or an isolated experiment. Building underground was a widespread, sustained practice among the Iron Age communities of Atlantic Europe, maintained across generations and across a surprisingly large territorial range. The typical souterrain is not large by the standards of the Hypogeum. Most are single passages, anywhere from a few meters to occasionally 20 or 30 meters in length, sometimes with lateral chambers branching off the main corridor. Some have entrance shafts that drop vertically before opening into horizontal passages. Some incorporate deliberate architectural features: a low section requiring anyone entering to crouch, a sharp turn in the passage, a narrowed throat that would force a person to squeeze through sideways. These features appear too consistently to be accidental, and they've generated significant debate about what exactly souterrains were designed to do and for whom. The most widely accepted interpretation, and the one that straightforward excavation evidence most often supports, is storage. Underground environments offer relatively stable temperatures year-round, cool in summer, frost-free in winter, making them genuinely practical for preserving food, particularly dairy products, grain and meat. Ireland's Atlantic climate, with its mild but damp conditions, makes this argument even more compelling, and analysis of souterrain deposits has produced animal bones, cereal residues, and ceramics consistent with food storage and processing. Some sites show evidence of wooden shelving or fittings, now long decayed but detectable through the marks left in the stone. On a purely functional level, a souterrain works as a refrigerator, and in communities dependent on stored food to survive winter and periods of shortage, that function had real survival value. But the purely functional explanation has never quite satisfied, and here's why. The architectural investment in many souterrains goes considerably beyond what efficient storage would require. Those deliberately lowered ceilings, those tight turns in the passage, those carefully positioned entrance shafts, these don't improve storage capacity. They control access, they make the souterrain difficult to enter quickly and in numbers, and they give any defender inside a significant advantage over anyone attempting to force entry from the outside. This has led to a parallel interpretation of souterrains as refuges, places where people could retreat during raids while above-ground settlements were ransacked. The Iron Age in Scotland and Ireland was not a peaceful period, and the archaeological record from surface settlements includes ample evidence of violence, burning, and repeated destruction. A space where people, children, valuables, or livestock could be concealed below ground while danger passed has obvious appeal in that context. Neither interpretation, though, accounts for everything the evidence shows. Some souterrains were associated with high-status settlements, the fortified sites known as duns in Scotland and ringforts in Ireland, and at these locations the souterrain may have served an additional social function. Controlling access to underground space, particularly underground space adjacent to the residence of a local leader, could have been a way of demonstrating authority. The souterrain as a feature of elite architecture, visible to visitors as a marker of resources and power, would explain why some examples are more elaborately built than their purely practical function would demand. Display and function aren't mutually exclusive, and in a society where resource management and social hierarchy were closely linked, the same structure could signal both. What excavation has also revealed is that many souterrains were not used for a single purpose across their lifespans. Sites that show early evidence of food storage sometimes later produce assemblages suggesting different activities, craft residues, unusual deposits, evidence of structured deposition that doesn't fit the profile of simple refuse disposal. At some Irish sites, deliberate deposits of objects in souterrain contexts, placed in ways that suggest intention rather than casual discard, have raised questions about whether these spaces also carried ritual or symbolic meaning. Whether this reflects a genuine shift in function across time, or whether symbolic significance was always layered onto practical use from the beginning, is difficult to determine from the material record alone. The longevity of souterrains as a tradition complicates classification further. Many were built during the earlier Iron Age and continued to be used, modified and repurposed well into the early medieval period, in some Irish cases into the early Christian centuries. A structure that begins as a food cellar in 300 BCE might look quite different in its deposits by 600 CE after 6 or more generations of occupation, modification, and shifting community needs. Trying to assign a single function to a structure with a lifespan measured in centuries is probably the wrong approach. Souterrains, like many long-lived architectural features, likely accumulated meaning over time, absorbing new purposes without necessarily losing old ones. What makes them genuinely difficult to classify with confidence is the combination of their regional variability, the incompleteness of excavated examples, and the challenge of reading purpose from physical form alone. A low lintel tells you that the entrance was difficult. It doesn't tell you whether the difficulty was intended to slow raiders, to create a ritual threshold, or simply to make efficient use of available stone. A deposit of animal bone could represent stored meat, a feasting episode, or a deliberate offering. The same structure, examined by two archaeologists with different interpretive frameworks, can produce quite different narratives, and both narratives can be consistent with the physical evidence. What we can say with some confidence is that for Iron Age communities along Europe's Atlantic coast, going underground was a meaningful act embedded in the rhythms of daily life. Whether for food, for safety, for social signaling, or for purposes we've not yet fully identified, people built these spaces, maintained them across generations, and in many cases kept them hidden from casual observation at the surface. The Souterrain isn't as dramatic as the Hypogeum, and it doesn't generate the same volume of popular speculation. But in its quiet, consistent presence beneath thousands of ordinary settlements, it raises a question that matters just as much. Why did so many communities, independently and persistently, choose to build a world beneath the one they lived in? If the Souterrains of Atlantic Europe represent underground construction on a scale that's at least partly legible, we can point to storage, refuge, social display, and find physical evidence that supports each. Then moving east into Central Europe introduces something far stranger. Scattered across Bavaria, Austria, and to a lesser extent parts of Bohemia and Hungary, there are hundreds of underground tunnel systems known as Erdstalls. The word is a German term of uncertain origin, possibly derived from words meaning earth and stall or place, and the structures it describes are among the most puzzling pieces of the subterranean record in Europe. Not because they are large or elaborately decorated. In fact, quite the opposite. Erdstalls are puzzling precisely because of how small, how awkward, and how seemingly pointless they are. The typical Erdstall is a narrow tunnel network, often no more than 60 to 90 centimeters in diameter. To enter one and move through it, an adult must crawl, and in the tightest sections must squeeze through openings that appear almost deliberately sized to make passage as difficult as possible. These aren't passages that became cramped due to collapse or millennia of settling. The walls are cleanly cut, the dimensions appear intentional. A full-grown person can get through them, but only just, and the experience is physically demanding and, for anyone with claustrophobic tendencies, genuinely distressing. That combination of intentional construction and deliberately restrictive dimensions is the first thing that sets Erdstalls apart from almost any other underground form we've discussed. The layouts compound the strangeness. Erdstalls typically consist of multiple chambers or sections connected by these narrow passages, but the overall design follows no obvious logic. Dead ends appear regularly, tunnels that run for several meters, and then simply stop, with no sign that they were left unfinished due to abandonment. Some passages loop back on themselves, some terminate in small chambers barely large enough to turn around in. Schlupfe, the German term used for the tightest of these squeeze passages, function like constriction points within the network, deliberate narrowings that anyone moving through the tunnel system must pass through, one at a time and with considerable effort. They occur too frequently and too consistently to be architectural accidents. Whoever designed these tunnels wanted the journey through them to be difficult. The dating problem makes everything more complicated. Unlike the Hypogeum, where precise radiocarbon and stratigraphic dating has established a reasonably clear prehistoric timeline, Erdstalls occupy a frustratingly ambiguous chronological space. Most currently dated examples cluster in the early medieval period, roughly the 10th through 13th centuries, which would place them well outside the prehistoric timeframe and into a Christian European context. This has led some researchers to dismiss them as a medieval phenomenon entirely, something particular to the communities and religious culture of the period. But the picture isn't that clean. Some Erdstalls show evidence of significantly earlier activity, and the relationship between medieval tunnels and potentially much older underlying structures hasn't been resolved at every site. Whether the tradition itself is medieval in origin, or whether medieval communities were continuing, adapting, or rediscovering something older, remains genuinely contested among those who study them closely. Across the roughly 3,000 examples identified in Bavaria and Austria alone, and that number continues to grow as systematic surveys turn up previously unrecorded examples beneath farms, church grounds, and ordinary fields, no single convincing explanation has emerged. The theories that have accumulated around Erdstalls are worth examining not because any one of them fully accounts for the evidence, but because each illuminates something the others miss. The hiding place theory is the most intuitive, small, concealed, nearly impossible to navigate quickly. An Erdstall would offer a plausible refuge during periods of violence or raid. Medieval Central Europe was not a stable environment, and the argument that peasant communities constructed these tunnel systems as places to conceal themselves and perhaps valuable goods during raids has a certain practical appeal. The problem is that the dimensions work against it. Squeezing a frightened family, including children and elderly members, through a schlupfer under duress, in darkness, while hostile forces searched above, it's not impossible, but it's far from the efficient refuge design would suggest. An underground hiding place intended for people would logically be somewhat more accommodating. The ritual and penitential interpretation picks up where practical explanations falter. Some researchers have proposed that Erdstalls were used in religious practices, particularly those involving crawling or physical hardship, as an act of penance or spiritual discipline. Christian penitential traditions in the early medieval period placed genuine value on bodily suffering as a pathway to spiritual benefit, and the experience of forcing oneself through the tightest sections of an Erdstall would certainly qualify as uncomfortable. There are analogies from other European religious practices, pilgrimage routes through narrow rock clefts, for instance, or the tradition of crawling through specific stone openings believed to have healing or purifying properties. If Erdstalls served as architecturally constructed versions of these natural features, built to provide a controlled experience of constriction and passage, the design that seems impractical by functional standards becomes coherent as intentional ordeal. A related but distinct theory frames Erdstalls as symbolic architecture, structures whose primary purpose was the experience of traversal rather than any activity conducted within them. The entrance, the squeeze, the narrow darkness, the dead ends, and the eventual emergence back at the surface could, in this reading, have constituted a complete ritual journey in themselves. Descent, difficulty, disorientation, and return. What that journey meant to the people who made it, whether it mapped onto ideas about death and rebirth, about spiritual trial, about encounter with something understood as dwelling underground, isn't recoverable from the physical structure alone. But the consistency of the design across hundreds of examples, spread across a substantial geographic area, suggests that whatever the intended experience was, it was communicated and reproduced with some fidelity across communities and generations. What deepens the mystery rather than resolving it is precisely the impracticality of the design. For nearly every proposed function, a more efficiently designed underground space would have served better. Larger chambers for storage, wider passages for refuge, different layouts for any agricultural or craft purpose that's been proposed. The Erdstall doesn't optimize for anything obvious, and that consistent failure to optimize is itself a data point. When a design persists across centuries and hundreds of examples, and that design appears actively inconvenient, you're probably not looking at a structure shaped by practical need. You're looking at something shaped by meaning that was clear enough to the people who built and used these tunnels that they reproduced the apparently uncomfortable form over and over again. We don't know what that meaning was. We may never know. The Erdstalls left behind no inscriptions, no datable assemblages that clearly illuminate purpose, no clear textual references in the medieval sources that might tell us what their builders called them or why they were dug. What they left behind is the shape of the experience itself, those narrow passages, those deliberate squeezes, those dead ends in the dark, waiting for an interpretation that the evidence, frustratingly, has not yet supplied. From the deliberate, almost punishing constriction of the Erdstall tunnels, we move to a very different kind of underground world, one carved not into the uncertainty of purpose, but into an explicit relationship with death. Or at least that's how it appears on the surface, because in Sardinia, the rock-cut tombs known as the Domus de Janas resist easy categorization in ways that make them far more interesting than simple burial chambers. The name itself is telling. In Sardinian, Domus de Janas means houses of the fairies or houses of the witches, depending on how you translate the folkloric figure of the Jana. The people who named these structures weren't archaeologists, and they weren't entirely wrong. These carved underground spaces do look like houses. Not tombs as we tend to imagine them, not vaults or pits or simple hollowed stones, but recognizable domestic interiors, complete with carved doorways, false doors that lead nowhere, ceiling beams cut from solid rock, hearths rendered in stone, pillars, niches and threshold details that closely imitate the architecture of the living world above ground. Someone looked at the rock face of Sardinia's landscape, carved a doorway into it, and then kept carving an entire world inside. There are more than 4,000 of these structures identified across the island. 4,000, that number alone forces a recalibration of how to think about them. These aren't scattered curiosities or regional anomalies. They represent a sustained, widespread, deeply embedded cultural practice that extended across millennia of Sardinian prehistory, with the majority attributed to the Ozieri culture and related Neolithic traditions dating from roughly 3,400 to 2,700 BCE, though the practice continued into the Copper Age and overlapped with subsequent cultural periods. The island's prehistoric communities were, collectively and persistently, carving cities into its rock faces. The interiors are what stop people. When you enter a well-preserved Domus de Janas, what you encounter isn't the sparse utilitarian interior of a grave. The carved beams overhead mimic wooden construction, the same construction that would have formed the ceiling of a house a living person slept beneath. False doors are carved into the rock, opening onto solid stone, never having functioned as passages and never intended to. Pilasters divide the space in ways that correspond to how rooms were divided in surface architecture. Some chambers have central pillars that serve no structural purpose in rock-cut space. The rock holds itself up, but that clearly reference the construction of actual built structures. In a few remarkable examples, the walls carry carved or painted bulls, horns, spirals, and geometric designs that reinforce the sense of a space carefully appointed and meant to resemble somewhere familiar. The interpretation that has long dominated is that these spaces were designed to house the dead the way a home housed the living, that they reflect a belief system in which death was understood as a continuation of domestic life conducted in a parallel world beneath the ground. The dead needed somewhere to be, and that somewhere was modelled on the places they had lived. The false doors may have served as symbolic passages, openings through which the spirit could pass, even as the stone remained solid for the living. The carved hearths weren't functional, they were furnishings in the same sense that grave goods are furnishings. The dead shouldn't be without a hearth any more than the living should be. What makes this interpretation compelling, and also somewhat insufficient, is the scale at which it was applied. A single tomb reflecting this logic would be a remarkable find. 4,000 tombs clustered in groups, sometimes running in sequences of dozens carved into the same cliff face or hillside, begins to produce something that functions less like a cemetery and more like a settlement. At Anghelu Ruju in the northwest of the island, over 30 Domus de Janas were carved in close proximity, forming what feels unmistakably like a planned complex. Different chambers, different scales of construction, different internal decoration, all organized within a shared landscape. At Sant'Andrea Pru, The tombs are so elaborately carved and so varied in their interior architecture that researchers have struggled to simply describe their full range without falling into the vocabulary of urban planning. This city-like quality isn't accidental, and it's worth taking seriously as more than a metaphor. When communities carve this many spaces this close together, over multiple generations and cultural periods, the resulting landscape carries social information. Which families or lineages had access to the more elaborately carved tombs? What did the scale of interior decorations signal about the status of the deceased, or the resources of those who mourned them? Some Domus de Janas show evidence of multiple burials across time, suggesting they functioned as ancestral repositories, places where a lineage returned again and again to deposit its dead, maintaining a connection to that specific carved chamber as a form of territorial or familial claim. The underground space became a way of asserting presence in the living landscape, because access to the dead and their resting places carried meaning for the communities that survived them. There's something else operating here that's worth pausing on: the act of memory. To carve a house for the dead that mirrors the architecture of the living is to perform a kind of translation, to say that what mattered in life, the form and feel of inhabited space, continues to matter after death. But it also creates a place that the living return to. Mourning rituals at these sites, feasting around or within the chambers, the ongoing maintenance and occasional expansion of tomb complexes across generations. All of this means that the Domus de Janas weren't simply deposits for the dead. They were places where the living enacted their relationship to their own past, where memory was given a physical address carved into stone. This is where the mystery deepens rather than resolves. We know what these spaces are in a broad technical sense. We can date the materials found inside them, we can map their distribution, we can trace changes in their design across different cultural phases. What we can't fully reconstruct is the lived experience of the communities who built and used them, the specific beliefs that animated the carved hearth, the precise understanding of what the false door was meant to accomplish, the social logic that determined which of 4,000 tombs a given family considered its own. What the Domus de Janas leave behind is a landscape saturated with intention. Every carved beam, every false threshold, every pilaster that mimics a structural element no longer structurally necessary, represents a choice, a decision to reproduce the world of the living inside the world of the dead, to an extraordinary degree of detail, at an extraordinary scale, across an extraordinary span of time. Whether that was an expression of comfort, of obligation, of religious conviction, or of something we don't yet have adequate vocabulary to describe, the stone itself can't say. But the sheer density of these spaces across Sardinia's landscape suggests that going underground, and going there in style, meant something profound, something worth reproducing 4,000 times over in the island's rock. Sardinia's carved houses for the dead give us one model of what prehistoric underground space could mean: a mirrored world built in stone, intimate and deliberate. Moving west across the Mediterranean to the Iberian Peninsula, we encounter something both related and distinct. Because in Iberia, the relationship between humans and the underground doesn't follow a single template. Instead, it fractures beautifully across region and time, offering a range of practices that refuse to settle into one explanation. The Iberian Peninsula has been inhabited for an extraordinary long time, and that depth of occupation means its prehistoric underground spaces reflect layer upon layer of different cultures, different needs, and different ways of understanding what lay beneath the surface. What emerges when you look at these sites collectively is not a unified tradition, but a conversation, one conducted across millennia in different regional dialects, about what the earth beneath the living world could hold and what it could mean. Start with the artificial caves across Portugal and Spain. Prehistoric communities carved chambers, galleries, and complex hypogeum directly into the bedrock in areas where natural caves were either unavailable or simply not what was wanted. The key word there is artificial. These weren't opportunistic uses of existing natural features. They were constructed, planned, excavated by human hands specifically to produce subterranean space that served human purposes. And that deliberate act of creation matters because it tells us that the underground wasn't simply available, it was chosen. These communities could have built above ground. They went below by intention. In southern Portugal, particularly in the Alentejo region and areas of the Tagus estuary, artificial funerary hypogea appear during the Chalcolithic period, roughly the 3rd millennium BCE, sometimes in clusters that suggest organized use of particular landscapes for collective burial. The Alapria hypogea near Estoril represent one of the better studied examples. Rock-cut chambers used for multiple burials across extended periods, containing the remains of dozens of individuals alongside grave goods that speak to connections between the living community and its accumulated dead. These weren't sealed once and forgotten deposits. They were reopened, maintained, added to. The relationship between the living and the underground chamber was ongoing, sustained, and apparently important enough to invest significant labor in maintaining. What's striking about many Iberian artificial caves is precisely this blurring of categories. When does a rock-cut chamber become something more than a tomb? When it's used repeatedly over generations, when it accumulates evidence of ritual deposits that go beyond the practical requirements of burial, when its entrance appears to have been deliberately oriented or its interior deliberately arranged, the space begins to function as something more complex than storage for the dead. Some Iberian hypogea show signs of use that extend into the realm of cult practice. Structured deposits of animal remains, symbolic objects placed in patterns that suggest repeated ceremony rather than single-event interment, evidence of burning that looks less like accident and more like deliberate offering. In southeastern Spain, the picture shifts again. The Los Millares culture, flourishing in what is now Andalusia and Almeria from around 3200 to 2200 BCE, produced a remarkably sophisticated funerary landscape in which passage graves and tholos tombs, corbelled underground chambers reached through entrance passages, formed organized cemeteries around fortified settlements. These spaces were clearly about the dead, but they were also about something else: the territorial and social claims of communities who built permanence into the landscape. The placement of tombs around the settlement at Los Millares isn't incidental. The dead, in their underground chambers, defined the edges of the living world and marked who had been here and for how long. The underground wasn't separate from the social landscape, it was part of its architecture. What makes Iberia particularly interesting is the way natural caves and human-made chambers overlap and interact throughout the prehistoric record. The peninsula has abundant natural karst geology, and communities used natural caves throughout prehistory for shelter, for burial, for painting, for ritual. But rather than replacing this practice, the artificial underground spaces seem to run alongside it and sometimes consciously reference it. Some rock-cut chambers incorporate natural rock features into their design, working with the geology rather than simply imposing form upon it. Others appear to deliberately reproduce the aesthetic of natural cave interiors, irregular surfaces, organic shapes, when the builders could equally well have created smooth, geometric spaces. The choice to evoke the natural cave in a man-made setting suggests that the power attributed to natural caves was something these communities wanted to access or invoke, even when the cave itself wasn't there. This is where Iberia's underground tradition becomes genuinely hard to categorize. In Malta or Sardinia, the relationship to the underground is relatively coherent. You can articulate the logic even if you can't prove the details. In Iberia, the underground seems to mean different things in different places and different periods, and sometimes different things within the same site, depending on how it was used across time. The Cueva de Menga in Malaga, a Neolithic dolmen chamber of enormous scale, is aligned not toward the sunrise like many comparable monuments, but toward a distant mountain peak, and recent work has suggested that a natural well inside the chamber, descending into the bedrock, may have been integral to the site's meaning, linking the chamber's astronomical and terrestrial orientation to a vertical axis that reached downward into the earth as well as outward across the landscape. If that interpretation holds, Menga isn't just a tomb or a ritual space, it's a node in a landscape that operates simultaneously above ground, on the surface, and below it. The ritual landscape, in other words, has depth as well as extent. That vertical dimension is something it's easy to overlook when thinking about prehistoric landscapes. We tend to think of sacred or significant spaces as features distributed across a surface, monuments, enclosures, paths between them. But if communities were also investing meaning in what lay beneath the surface, in descending into chambers, in wells that reached into the rock, in artificial caves that reproduced the uncanny quality of natural ones, then the landscape they inhabited wasn't flat. It had a third axis, and moving along that axis, downward, was an act that carried its own meaning. Across the Iberian Peninsula, that meaning wasn't fixed. Northern and Atlantic-facing Iberia has its own traditions of underground and semi-subterranean space, connected to the broader Atlantic European context that produced the Souterrains of Ireland and Scotland. The Meseta has its rock-cut traditions. The south has the Chalcolithic hypogea and the sophisticated funerary architecture of Los Miliares. None of these neatly reduce to the same explanation, and forcing them into a single framework would misrepresent what the evidence actually shows. What Iberia offers, instead, is a demonstration of something important, that going underground was never one thing. It was a repertoire of possibilities: burial, gathering, cult, territorial claim, initiation, memory, cosmological orientation that different communities drew on in different ways, shaped by local geology, local tradition, and local need. The artificial caves and subterranean landscapes of the peninsula aren't a single story. They're a reminder that prehistoric people approached the underground with the same complexity and regional variety that they brought to everything else they built. The regional diversity that Iberia makes so visible becomes even more striking when you move to the opposite edge of prehistoric Europe, north and west, to a scatter of islands off the top of Scotland, where a different relationship with the underground was taking shape. Because if Iberia shows us that going below ground meant different things in different places, Orkney shows us something perhaps even more fundamental, that the line between underground and ordinary may have been far more porous than we usually assume. Skara Brae is one of the most famous prehistoric sites in Europe, and for good reason. Buried under a sand dune on the Orkney mainland for thousands of years, it survived extraordinarily well, a cluster of stone-built dwellings dating to around 3,100 to 2,500 BCE, connected by covered passageways, still containing furniture, hearths, and the unmistakable texture of everyday life. You can look into these structures today and see stone shelves, stone beds, stone dressers arranged around central hearths, as if the inhabitants simply stepped away one afternoon and never came back. It is a deeply human place, but what's often underemphasized in popular accounts of Skara Brae is how its architecture engages with the ground itself. These weren't buildings that sat on top of a landscape. They were built down into it, embedded within a midden, accumulated layers of organic refuse and earth, that provided the outer walls with insulation and the structures with a kind of thermal mass that would have been transformative in the Orcadian climate. The settlement was, in a meaningful sense, semi-subterranean. Not carved into bedrock, not tunneled into a hillside, but deliberately sunk into the earth, built low, roofed and covered, sheltered from the ferocious winds that scour those islands for much of the year. To understand why this matters, you have to understand Orkney's climate. The islands sit at nearly 60 degrees north latitude, and while they are warmed somewhat by the Gulf Stream, they are routinely subjected to winds that make above-ground exposure deeply uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. Orkney averages something like 6 or 7 hours of sunshine in January. Winters are long, dark and relentless. In that environment, the decision to build downward rather than upward isn't mystical, it's sensible. Earth is one of the best natural insulators available. A structure embedded in the ground, surrounded by accumulated organic material, sheltered from wind by the mound above it, would hold heat far more effectively than a freestanding structure exposed to open air. The Neolithic inhabitants of Orkney understood this, and they built accordingly. The covered passageways connecting the structures at Skara Brae reinforced this logic. Movement between dwellings didn't require exposure to the elements. The community could function in winter without repeatedly stepping into the cold and wind. That kind of sheltered connectivity suggests a high degree of social interdependence, a community that moved, communicated, and presumably shared resources across its linked spaces as a functioning unit. The underground, or near underground, here is not about secrecy or ritual. It is about survival and solidarity made architectural. And yet it would be a mistake to treat Skara Brae as purely functional and leave it there. The same Orcadian culture that built these earthed-in dwellings also constructed the great passage graves of Maeshowe, Coyness and Cueen Hill, sophisticated underground chambers that were clearly not domestic in purpose. Maeshowe in particular is a remarkable structure. A corbelled chamber entered through a low, narrow passage, aligned so precisely that midwinter sunlight penetrates directly to the back wall. The people who built Skara Brae and the people who built Maeshowe were operating within the same cultural world, drawing on the same material tradition, using stone with the same confident sophistication. They were building below ground at both registers, the everyday and the ceremonial, and those two registers were likely in conversation. This raises a question that deserves to be taken seriously. Did practical engagement with the underground help generate ritual or symbolic meaning attributed to subterranean space? If your home is half buried in the earth, if you move through covered passages, if the walls around you are the compressed material of generations of occupation layered into the ground, then descent is not exotic. It is familiar. It is where you sleep, where you eat, where you pass the winter. And, if descent is already familiar, already associated with warmth and shelter and safety, then using underground space for acts of significance, for placing the dead, for conducting ceremonies that require enclosed and controlled conditions, might feel like a natural extension of what you already know the underground to offer. This is the kind of interpretive question that archaeology can pose but not definitively answer. We can observe that Orcadian culture was intensely engaged with the ground, above, at, and below the surface, in both domestic and funerary contexts. We can note that the technical skills required to build the passages at Maeshowe and the connected chambers at Skara Brae overlap considerably. We can observe that a culture practiced in working with the earth, in building into it and within it, would have had both the capability and the conceptual vocabulary to invest subterranean space with meaning. But the inner life of that meaning is not directly accessible to us. What is accessible is the architecture itself, and it speaks to a relationship with the ground that is intimate and sustained. Earth-sheltered construction of the kind seen at Skara Brae differs fundamentally from deep tunnel systems or rock-cut hypogea. This is not a matter of excavating chambers in bedrock or burrowing through geological strata, but it occupies the same conceptual territory in the sense that it represents a deliberate choice to locate human life below the level of the open surface, to use the ground itself as material and partner in the construction of livable space. The technical difference is real. The underlying orientation, downward, inward, sheltered, connects. It also invites a broader reflection on how we categorize prehistoric underground traditions. We tend to draw firm lines between the domestic and the ritual, between practical and symbolic, between everyday and sacred. But those lines are modern distinctions that may not map cleanly onto how Neolithic communities organize their understanding of the world. A culture where home is partially underground, where the dead are placed in underground chambers aligned with astronomical events, where covered passages connect the spaces of the living, such a culture may not have experienced a sharp division between the mundane underground and the meaningful one. Both might have participated in a broader sense of what the earth held and what it meant to enter it. Orkney, in this light, becomes a kind of test case for thinking about origins. It's tempting to look at the elaborate ritual underground spaces of prehistoric Europe, the Hypogeum of Malta, the passage graves of Ireland, the carved tombs of Sardinia, and ask where the impulse to go underground came from, as if it must have had a single point of origin in ceremony or belief. But Orkney suggests a different possibility. Perhaps for some communities the underground tradition didn't begin with ritual at all. Perhaps it began with cold, perhaps it began with wind. Perhaps the first step downward was simply practical, and everything that came to be built on that foundation, all the meaning, all the ceremony, all the symbolic weight of descent grew from a beginning that was fundamentally, unglamorously, about staying warm. Orkney already gives us one end of the spectrum, the underground as dwelling, as warmth, as the architecture of survival. But the passage graves of Neolithic Europe represent something that feels more deliberately constructed as an experience. Not just a space below ground, but a sequence, a journey with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The passage grave, wherever it appears across the Atlantic facade of Europe, is not simply a hole in the earth where bodies were placed. It is a choreographed encounter with darkness, enclosure, and whatever waited at the centre. The distribution of these monuments is remarkable in itself. From the Boyne Valley in Ireland to the Morbihan coast of Brittany, from the passage tombs of the Iberian Peninsula to the chambered cairns of Scotland and Wales, communities separated by geography and time were independently arriving at something structurally similar, a long, low corridor leading into the earth or into a constructed mound, opening into one or more chambers, built with enormous precision from stone that required massive collective effort to quarry, transport, and assemble. The consistency of the form across such distances is one of the things that makes passage graves so compelling and so difficult to reduce to a single tidy explanation. Take the Newgrange Monument in County Meath, Ireland, built around 3200 BCE, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids at Giza. What survives is extraordinary. A massive circular mound nearly 80 metres across and 12 metres high, fronted with white quartz, encircling a passage 19 metres long that leads to a cruciform chamber. The engineering alone is astonishing. The corbelled roof of the inner chamber has kept water out for over 5,000 years without any mortar. But what elevates Newgrange from impressive engineering to something harder to categorise is the roof box positioned above the entrance, a precisely constructed aperture designed so that at the winter solstice, at the moment of sunrise, a shaft of light travels the full length of the passage and illuminates the chamber floor for approximately 17 minutes. Then the light retreats. The chamber returns to total darkness. It would be easy to reach for a single interpretation: Newgrange as solar observatory, Newgrange as fertility symbol, Newgrange as tomb aligned with the moment when the sun is reborn. Each of those explanations contains something real, but none of them is sufficient alone, and it's worth sitting with that discomfort rather than resolving it artificially. The light phenomenon is real, precisely engineered, and cannot have been accidental. The bones found within the chamber are real, cremated human remains, among them individuals who may have been specially selected. The architecture of the passage itself is real. The low, narrow corridor that forces the body into a crouched, vulnerable posture. The sense of the mound pressing overhead. The transition from cold outdoor light to absolute interior darkness as you move inward. Whatever meaning was attached to this place, it was meaning that had to be physically experienced in a specific way, through a specific sequence of movement and sensation. That quality of sequenced, controlled experience is what unites passage graves across their geographical range, even when the details differ significantly. At Gavranes in Brittany, a passage grave that also dates to the Neolithic, the inner walls of the corridor are covered in dense, intricate carved spirals and geometric patterns that run from floor to ceiling. Moving through the passage toward the chamber, you are surrounded by carved stone that responds differently to light at different angles, in the flickering of whatever illumination the builders and users would have carried. Those surfaces must have seemed alive. The chamber itself is at the far end, smaller, darker, and the journey to reach it is the point. The passage at Gavranes doesn't just lead somewhere, it prepares you. In the Iberian Peninsula, the passage grave tradition takes forms that are sometimes simpler in execution, but no less considered in intent. The great megalithic tombs of the Alentejo in Portugal, or the dolmens of Andalusia, share the same fundamental logic: a defined threshold, a corridor, a chamber. Some are oriented towards solstice events, others face the rising moon. Many face east towards sunrise, though not with the precision engineering of Newgrange's light box. What matters across all of them is the consistent treatment of the underground, or the mound enclosed space, as somewhere that is not simply arrived at, but approached. The question of what that approach meant is where interpretation becomes genuinely open. Descent in many human cultures carries associations with death, with the underworld, with the realm of ancestors, and passage graves are undeniably connected to the dead, given what has been found inside them. But they are connected to the dead in specific, selective ways. The chambers at Newgrange did not contain every member of the community. They contained particular individuals, perhaps over extended periods, perhaps introduced in sequence across generations. The graves were not sealed permanently in the way we might associate with a modern conception of burial. They were re-entered. The bones inside were sometimes rearranged, moved, sorted. The dead were not passively deposited, but actively managed. This suggests that passage graves functioned as places of ongoing relationship with the ancestral dead, not simply sites of disposal. The living came back. They moved through the passage again. They handled the remains of those who had been placed there. That repeated journey underground into the space where the dead resided, where darkness was absolute, where seasonal light might briefly and dramatically return, was presumably embedded in a cosmological framework that integrated the dead, the living, the earth, and celestial time into something coherent. We don't have the framework spelled out for us, but we can read its architecture. There is a concept that some archaeologists describe as structured deposition, the idea that the placement of objects and remains in these spaces followed deliberate rules. That meaning was encoded in arrangement, orientation, and sequence. The passage grave extends this idea to the body itself. You don't simply arrive in the chamber. You crawl through darkness, perhaps in single file, perhaps guided only by firelight, surrounded by stone. Your body enacts a transition. Whether that transition was understood as mimicking death, as entering the realm of ancestors, as passing through the Earth's body to reach some other state of being, or as some combination of all these things, we cannot say with certainty. But the architecture makes clear that the journey itself was considered essential. That is what separates passage graves from simple underground chambers, and what makes them central to any serious account of subterranean thinking in prehistoric Europe. They are not just holes in the ground where the dead were kept. They are arguments in stone about what the underground means, built to last millennia, engineered to respond to the sky, designed to transform the person who moves through them. And they represent enormous investments of collective labor and social organization, which tells us that whatever was understood to happen inside them mattered enormously to the people who built and used them. These communities were not stumbling into underground space out of necessity. They were constructing underground experience with extraordinary intention, and they were doing it at the same time, across the same stretch of Atlantic Europe, in forms too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, and too varied to reduce to a single origin or meaning. What drove that consistency remains genuinely open. What produced that intention, and what those 17 minutes of winter light in the chamber at Newgrange meant to the person who witnessed them, those are questions the stones preserve without quite answering. Before we get too deep into the symbolic and the ceremonial, it's worth pausing because sometimes the most honest thing an investigator can do is return to Earth. Literally. Whatever metaphysical weight we attach to underground spaces in prehistoric Europe, these were also structures built by people who had grain to protect, communities to defend, and enemies who occasionally came looking for both. The practical explanations for subterranean construction are not glamorous, but they are real, and they deserve a serious accounting before we decide how far they actually get us. Start with temperature. This is not a minor detail, it's a physical law that underground spaces, once you get even a few meters below the surface, maintain a remarkably stable thermal environment year-round. In much of temperate Europe, that means somewhere between 8 and 12 degrees Celsius, regardless of what's happening above ground. For a community storing grain, dried meat, dairy products, or seed stock through a northern European winter or a Mediterranean summer, that stability is not a convenience. It is the difference between your community eating in spring and not eating. Souterrains across Scotland and Ireland, many of which connect directly to surface settlements, are precisely the right size, shape, and temperature for cold storage. Some have internal drainage features, some show evidence of organic material, the residue of what was once stored there. The correlation between their construction and their function as larders is, in several well-documented cases, genuinely strong. The same logic extends to valuables beyond food. Precious objects, textiles, tools with significant labor investment, anything you wanted to protect from fire, flood, theft, or the general unpredictability of surface life could benefit from the same stable, concealed environment. The narrow entrances common to Souterrains and Erdstall tunnels are not just acoustically interesting or symbolically suggestive of rebirth, they are also defensible. A single person can control a narrow passage. A group cannot rush through it. Whatever entered those tunnels could be retrieved deliberately or not retrieved at all if discovery meant danger. Which brings us to the conflict hypothesis. The idea that some underground networks functioned as refuge systems during periods of raiding or social instability. This explanation has intuitive appeal, particularly for regions and time periods where archaeological evidence suggests elevated conflict. The Atlantic Iron Age, for instance, was not a peaceful era in Atlantic Europe. Hill forts, coastal defences and significant weapon assemblages all testify to communities that had real enemies and organised responses to them. The proliferation of souterrains in Ireland and Scotland during roughly this same period is not obviously coincidental. If raiders came to a settlement looking for people, livestock and stored goods, having a concealed underground chamber that could hide both people and provisions is not a mystical strategy. It's a sensible one. The evidence for this interpretation is partly architectural and partly contextual. Some souterrains have entrance mechanisms that could be sealed or concealed from within. Some connect to structures in ways that suggest rapid, unobtrusive access. You could be inside quickly, and the entrance could be difficult to locate from outside if you didn't know where to look. The narrowness that makes Erdstall passages so physically demanding to navigate also makes them poor environments for armed pursuit. You cannot swing a weapon effectively in a tunnel where you can barely turn around. But here is where the practical explanations start to develop their own complications. If souterrains were primarily cold storage, why do some of them show no clear evidence of stored goods at all? Why are some oriented, decorated, or arranged in ways that serve no obvious thermal or defensive function? The Hypogeum of Ħal Saflieni in Malta maintains a naturally stable temperature, yes, but its carved recesses, its acoustic properties, its trilithon facades, its ornamentation, and its sheer scale of labour investment go far beyond anything required to keep food cold. If the Domus de Janas of Sardinia were purely functional burial chambers, why were interior walls carved with false doorways that led nowhere, with symbolic furniture that served no practical purpose for the dead? The mundane explanation accounts for some of what we find. It does not account for all of it. Even in the cases that seem most practically clear-cut, questions accumulate. Erdstall tunnels in Bavaria and Austria, and there are now more than 700 documented examples, have been studied carefully enough that we can say with some confidence what they probably were not. They were not aqueducts. They were not large-scale grain stores because they are too small and their distribution too irregular for that to explain their numbers. They were not straightforward defensive tunnels because many of them have no connection to fortified structures or obvious threat environments. The best current assessment is that they were probably constructed during the medieval period, not the prehistoric era, but even that more constrained timeline hasn't resolved what they were for. Temporary hiding places, ritual crawl spaces, something attached to folk practices that left no other material trace. The practical framework suggests purpose without identifying it. This is the pattern that recurs across subterranean Europe, physical evidence that points toward function and then gaps where the function becomes unclear. Storage makes sense for some sites in some periods. Refuge makes sense for others. Simple structural logic, the desire for warmth, shelter from weather, the use of natural rock as a building material that didn't require felling trees or cutting and drying timber, explains some of the basic impulse to go underground. There's nothing mysterious about wanting to work with the landscape rather than against it. And yet, the Hypogeum holds the remains of around 7,000 individuals. That is not a storage facility. The passage at Newgrange was engineered to respond to a specific astronomical moment with a precision that required sustained observation, collective knowledge, and extraordinary technical skill. That is not a larder. The carved spirals of Gavrinis line a corridor designed for physical experience, not for efficient access to stored goods. Practical needs were real, and they shaped real decisions about where and how to build underground. But they coexist in many of these sites with evidence of intention that exceeds the practical, evidence of meaning-making, of investment that goes beyond utility, of spatial arrangement that only makes sense if the underground was understood as carrying significance beyond its temperature and its concealment. The honest position is that the practical explanations are neither wrong nor sufficient. They explain a real layer of why these spaces were built and how some of them were used. They may even explain the initial impulse in many cases. You start building underground because you need storage, and then something else happens. The space begins to mean something. The experience of being below ground, of moving through darkness and enclosure, of existing briefly in a world separated from the surface. That experience apparently generated ideas and practices that went beyond keeping grain cool or hiding from raiders. Understanding that both things can be true at once, that a space can be practical and symbolic, functional and sacred, built for survival and experienced as something more, might be the most important conceptual tool we have for making sense of what prehistoric Europeans were doing beneath the ground. The mundane answers are not wrong. They're just not the whole story. And the distance between what those answers explain and what the archaeology actually shows us is precisely where the real questions begin. So where do those real questions take us? If the practical explanations form a floor beneath which our understanding cannot fall, the ritual interpretations are the ceiling we keep reaching toward, and the distance between them is where the most interesting thinking happens. Let's start with something that sounds abstract, but is actually quite physical. When you enter an underground space, a true underground space, not a basement or a subway, something happens to you. The light changes, then it disappears, sound behaves differently. Your sense of spatial orientation, normally anchored by horizon lines and ambient movement, begins to dissolve. Temperature drops. The smell of soil and stone replaces everything familiar. Your breathing sounds louder. You become acutely aware of the limits of your own body. And if you go far enough in, you can lose all sense of direction, duration, and even self-continuity in ways that are genuinely disorienting. This is not a modern neurological observation projected backward onto ancient experience. This is what underground spaces do to human beings, and it would have done the same thing to people 10,000 years ago. The question archaeologists working in what's now called sensory archaeology have started asking is whether prehistoric communities knew this, and whether they built for it deliberately. The evidence suggests they might have. The acoustic properties of the Hypogeum of Ħal Saflieni have been studied extensively, and what researchers have found is striking. Certain chambers produce resonance frequencies in the range of 110 Hz, a deep, sustained reverberation that in experimental conditions has been shown to affect neural oscillation patterns associated with trance-like states and suppressed critical thinking. The oracle chamber, as it's been named, is shaped in a way that concentrates this effect. Whether that shaping was intentional or discovered through use and then reinforced, we genuinely don't know. But the effect is real, reproducible, and profoundly unusual. Similar acoustic phenomena have been documented in painted cave systems in France and Spain, where the locations of Paleolithic art cluster significantly around points of maximum resonance. Sound and depth and meaning appear to have been connected for a very long time. Confinement also matters. The Erdstall passages of Central Europe require crawling, twisting, pressing through gaps that feel designed to test, or perhaps transform, the person moving through them. The architecture of passage graves like Newgrange or Maeshowe in Orkney controls movement. Precisely, you enter one way, at a specific height, along a specific axis, before arriving in a central chamber that feels categorically different from the approach. That choreography is not accidental, and it doesn't serve storage or defense. It serves experience. It shapes what happens to a person as they move from outside to inside, from surface to depth, from one state to another. This is where descent as transformation enters the conversation, not as speculation, but as a framework with cross-cultural depth. Ethnographic records from cultures across the world, cultures that have no historical connection to prehistoric Europe, consistently associate underground spaces with liminality, the threshold state between what you were and what you will become. Initiation rituals in numerous indigenous traditions involve periods of confinement, darkness and disorientation that are understood to dissolve the initiate's previous identity before reforming them as something new. The underground is a womb, it is a grave, it is both simultaneously a place where something ends and something else begins. Now, it would be a serious mistake to simply lift these ethnographic parallels and paste them onto Neolithic Malta or Iron Age Ireland. The cultures are different, the contexts are different, and the evidence we have for prehistoric European belief is fragmentary enough that almost any interpretation can claim some support and almost none can claim certainty. What the ethnographic parallels offer is not proof. They offer plausibility. They demonstrate that the interpretation we're reaching for, that underground spaces functioned as sites of ritual transformation, is not an invention of modern romanticism. It is a documented pattern of human behavior across genuinely diverse cultures. That doesn't make it true for any specific prehistoric European site, but it does make it credible as a hypothesis worth investigating. What we can say with more confidence is this: many of these sites were not built for individual use. The Hypogeum held 7,000 people over the course of its use, not all at once but across generations, in a practice that clearly had communal structure and communal significance. Passage graves were revisited, reopened, modified and reused in ways that suggest ongoing relationship rather than simple disposal. Ancestors were not left behind when they were placed underground. They were consulted, incorporated into living ritual, made part of the community's continuing story. Descent into these spaces may have been understood as descent toward the dead, a movement across the boundary that separated the living from those who had preceded them, a controlled form of contact with another order of existence. That language sounds mystical, but the material evidence actually supports something like this interpretation. The disarticulated, rearranged, mixed bone assemblages found in many megalithic chambers suggest that the dead were not treated as individuals to be interred and left. They were handled, sorted, returned to, used. The space that held them was a working space, not an archive. What that work consisted of, what it meant to go underground into the presence of ancestral remains, we cannot say with certainty. But it was clearly not nothing, and it was clearly repeated, organized, and significant. The difficulty with ritual interpretation is precisely its strength. It can explain almost anything. Unusual spatial arrangements, ritual. No clear functional purpose, ritual. Expensive labor with no obvious return, ritual. When an explanation fits too many data points with too little resistance, it risks becoming circular. Saying something was ritual can become a way of stopping inquiry rather than advancing it, a label that performs understanding without achieving it. This is why the most careful work in this area combines sensory analysis, spatial analysis, material assemblage study, and comparative ethnography without collapsing any of those strands into a single definitive claim. What we can say is that the underground spaces of prehistoric Europe were experienced spaces, spaces that shaped the people who moved through them, that accumulated meaning through repeated use, that connected the living to the dead and the present to the ancestral past. Whether any specific site was used for initiation, for oracle consultation, for mortuary ritual, for altered state ceremony, or for some combination of practices we have no modern equivalent for that remains genuinely open. What is not open is the underlying reality that these communities invested extraordinary effort in constructing environments that went beyond what survival required. They were building for experience. They were shaping what it felt like to be in a particular place, at a particular depth, in a particular darkness. The fact that we struggle to name exactly what that experience was supposed to produce is not evidence that the question is unanswerable. It is evidence that we are still learning how to ask it properly. Understanding why prehistoric communities built underground is only half the challenge. The other half is figuring out how we know what we think we know, and being honest about the significant gap between what the evidence actually shows and what we want it to tell us. The methods archaeologists use to investigate subterranean sites are sophisticated, constantly evolving, and still fundamentally limited in ways that matter enormously to the questions we're asking. Start with the basic problem of access. Underground sites are not passive archives waiting to be read. They are dynamic environments that have been collapsing, filling, flooding, and transforming for thousands of years. Many Erdstall passages in Central Europe have sections that are simply too dangerous to enter without structural reinforcement. Sections of the Hypogeum required careful stabilization before modern study was even possible. When archaeologists do gain access, they are often working in cramped, poorly ventilated conditions where conventional excavation tools and standard field documentation become genuinely awkward to deploy. You cannot swing a trowel freely in a passage where the ceiling is 40 centimeters above your head. Physical constraints shape what gets investigated, which shapes what evidence gets recorded, which shapes what conclusions become available. That chain of compromise runs through almost everything we think we know about these spaces. Contamination is a related problem that is easy to underestimate. Underground environments preserve remarkably well in some respects, more on that shortly, but that same preservation quality means that material from vastly different time periods can end up occupying the same physical layer in ways that are extremely difficult to disentangle. Sites that were in use for centuries accumulate debris from all of those centuries, and sites that were reused by later populations accumulate material from those periods too. An Iron Age community sheltering in a Neolithic passage grave leaves traces that don't announce themselves clearly. A medieval farmer who uses a souterrain for storage adds organic material that muddies radiocarbon results. Distinguishing original construction from subsequent use from casual intrusion requires painstaking analysis, and it frequently produces ambiguous results. Dating itself deserves a careful look because it is often presented as more definitive than it actually is. Radiocarbon dating is the most widely applied method, and it has genuinely transformed our understanding of prehistoric chronology. But radiocarbon dates organic material, charcoal, bone, seeds, carbonized plant matter, not stone. When you date the construction of a stone-cut chamber, you are actually dating the organic material found in association with that chamber, which may have been deposited at construction or may have arrived later or earlier through processes you cannot fully reconstruct. A hearth inside a passage does not date the passage. It dates the use of fire in that space at some point in its history. Stratigraphy, the study of sediment layers and their vertical relationships, helps anchor these dates in sequence. But stratified deposits in underground spaces are frequently disturbed by both human activity and natural processes like water infiltration and root penetration. Material culture comparison adds another interpretive layer. When the pottery styles, tool types, or ornamental objects found in an underground space match those known from dated surface contexts elsewhere, archaeologists can use those parallels to suggest a probable time range. This is useful but imprecise, since objects travel, persist, and are reused across long periods. Environmental evidence, pollen, phytoliths, insect remains, charred seeds, adds texture by indicating what the broader landscape looked like during periods of occupation, which helps situate sites in ecological and agricultural context. Taken together, these methods produce a picture that is probabilistic rather than certain, and the difference between those two things is significant when you're trying to explain why something was built. Here is where preservation does something double-edged. The underground environment protects organic materials that would have rotted away within decades on the surface, can survive for millennia in cool, stable, anaerobic conditions. This is why some of the most extraordinary organic assemblages in prehistoric archaeology come from caves and underground chambers, intact wooden objects, textiles, human hair, plant fibers that give us genuine insight into daily life and material culture. That preservation capacity feels like a gift, and in many ways it is. But it also creates interpretive traps. A site that preserves well looks more complete than it actually is. Surviving evidence biases our picture toward what the underground environment happens to protect, rather than toward what was actually most important about the space. Perishable elements of ritual, music, movement, spoken language, fire and smoke, body paint, leave no trace at all. The things that likely mattered most may be entirely invisible to us. Newer investigative technologies are beginning to reshape questions that earlier scholarship could not even properly formulate. Three-dimensional laser scanning and photogrammetry now allow complete geometric documentation of underground spaces that would have taken months to hand measure and still resulted in imprecise plans. These digital models enable analysis of spatial relationships, sightlines, and proportional choices that reveal intentional design decisions in ways that flat drawings simply cannot capture. Researchers studying the Hypogeum have used this kind of modeling alongside acoustic analysis to understand how sound was managed or engineered within the carved chambers, producing insights about intentionality that were impossible to demonstrate without the precise spatial data. Micromorphology, the microscopic analysis of sediment-thin sections cut from excavated deposits, has become one of the most valuable tools available for underground site investigation. It allows researchers to identify sequences of burning, trampling, flooding, and decomposition within a single centimeter of soil, reconstructing patterns of activity that are completely invisible to conventional excavation. The evidence of sustained foot traffic, repeated fire use, and accumulating organic debris preserved in these microscopic layers tells a story about how intensively and how regularly a space was used. Acoustic studies, meanwhile, go beyond simply documenting resonance effects. They attempt to model how soundscapes would have been experienced at different periods, accounting for changes in chamber morphology caused by collapse or modification. What all of this underscores is something important about the nature of uncertainty in this field. When historians and archaeologists admit they cannot fully explain a prehistoric underground site, that admission is not a failure of attention or a gap in scholarly effort. It is an honest reflection of what the evidence makes possible. The methods are rigorous, the researchers are careful, but the questions being asked of fragmentary, ancient, deeply unusual sites are extraordinarily demanding questions, and the evidence that survives is simply not sufficient to answer all of them cleanly. This matters because it shifts the conversation from mystery to method. The underground cities of prehistoric Europe are not unexplained because they defy explanation. They are incompletely explained because complete explanation requires evidence that either no longer exists or has not yet been recovered. That is a genuinely different kind of mystery, less dramatic perhaps, but ultimately more interesting. Because it means the answers, at least some of them, are still out there, waiting in sediment layers and stone geometries and acoustic frequencies that nobody has measured yet. That gap between what evidence makes possible and what people want to believe is exactly where mythology moves in. And with prehistoric underground architecture, mythology has moved in enthusiastically, prolifically, and with remarkable staying power. The most persistent popular claim is probably the one about vast interconnected tunnel networks running beneath Europe. The idea that the Erdstalls, the Souterrains, the Hypogea, the passage graves and the rock-cut chambers are not isolated regional phenomena, but fragments of a single enormous system linking sites across thousands of kilometers, built by a forgotten civilization operating at a scale that mainstream archaeology refuses to acknowledge. This claim circulates widely online, appears in documentary titles, and gets repeated with enough confidence that it can sound like a genuine scholarly controversy rather than what it actually is, an unfounded assertion that does not survive contact with the physical evidence. The documented reality is that these underground structures cluster within distinct regional traditions, reflect local geology, use locally available techniques, and were constructed across vast spans of time by communities that almost certainly had no contact with one another. Erdstalls in Bavaria have nothing demonstrably in common with Maltese Hypogeum, beyond the basic fact of being underground. Sardinian Domus de Janas do not connect to Irish Souterrains through hidden passages. When you look at the actual spatial distribution of these sites, what you see is not a network. It is a pattern of independent human responses to similar pressures and possibilities, playing out across different cultures, different centuries, different environmental and social contexts. The evidence for a unified continental tunnel system does not exist. What exists is the persistent human desire to find one. That desire is worth taking seriously on its own terms, because it points to something real about how people relate to unexplained ancient structures. When you encounter a passage carved precisely into rock by people whose names we will never know, whose language left no written trace, whose motivations remain genuinely uncertain, something in human cognition reaches for narrative to fill the space. Theories about secret civilizations, suppressed histories, advanced technologies lost to catastrophe, or hidden priestly orders preserving forbidden knowledge are not arbitrary inventions. They are pattern completion responses. The mind finds a gap, recognizes that standard accounts do not fully close it, and supplies a story that does. The story usually involves hidden knowledge, because hidden knowledge explains why the experts don't know. They're either excluded from the secret or actively suppressing it. Pseudo-historical accounts of prehistoric underground sites tend to share certain structural features. They invoke the idea of mainstream archaeology as a gatekeeper institution protecting comfortable orthodoxies. They present real unanswered questions, and there are genuine unanswered questions, as we've established, as evidence that the official story is being withheld rather than evidence that the science is ongoing and incomplete. They cherry-pick the most dramatic measurements, the most unusual acoustic properties, the most striking visual features, and then draw enormous inferential leaps without accounting for the simpler explanations that researchers have evaluated and found plausible. And they often cite genuine scholars' work in ways those scholars would not recognize, stripping findings of their context and caveats to make them sound more mysterious than the researchers themselves considered them to be. This is genuinely frustrating for the people doing the actual fieldwork, because the sensationalized version of their sites often becomes the version that the public encounters first. Researchers studying the Hypogeum have watched its acoustic properties described online as proof of mind control technology, sonic weapons, or alien engineering, conclusions that bear no relationship to what the acoustic studies actually suggest, which is intentional but entirely human-scale manipulation of resonance within a carved space. When the dramatic version circulates widely enough, it shapes what questions visitors ask, what documentary commissions get funded, and sometimes what political narratives get attached to ancient sites. Heritage management becomes more complicated when the mythology around a site is powerful enough to attract people who care more about confirming a theory than understanding an artifact. And yet the public fascination itself is not without value, even when it runs ahead of the evidence. These sites receive attention, funding, and conservation concern partly because they have captured imaginations. The Hypogeum is a UNESCO World Heritage Site with careful visitor management, not only because archaeologists advocated for it, but because enough people found it compelling enough to protect. Souterrains in rural Ireland that might otherwise have been backfilled during agricultural modernisation have been documented and sometimes preserved, because local communities felt a sense of connection to the mystery attached to them. Fascination is not the same as accuracy, but it creates conditions in which accuracy becomes possible, in which sites survive long enough to be properly studied, in which funding bodies consider prehistoric subterranean architecture a worthy investment. The more interesting challenge is directing that fascination toward the questions that the actual evidence opens up, because those questions are genuinely compelling without requiring any embellishment. Why does the Hypogeum's main chamber amplify certain vocal frequencies in ways that appear deliberate? Nobody fully knows. How did Neolithic communities coordinate the labor and engineering knowledge required to build Newgrange or Maeshowe to the tolerances they achieved? The mechanics of that social organization remain genuinely puzzling. What was the relationship between the living communities who built the Domus de Janas and the dead they placed inside them? And what did that relationship mean for how those communities understood their own continuity through time? These questions don't need secret civilizations or suppressed discoveries to be worth asking. They are demanding sophisticated questions about human cognition, social organization, and the relationship between built environments and belief systems, and the evidence available to answer them is incomplete enough that the answers genuinely remain open. The mystery keeps growing, not because new revelations keep emerging, but because the field keeps developing better tools for asking questions the evidence can partially address, and partial answers, in genuinely complex systems, tend to multiply questions rather than resolve them. Every micromorphology study that identifies a new activity pattern in an underground space raises new questions about who was performing that activity and why. Every acoustic model that confirms intentional resonance engineering raises questions about what sounds were being made and what they meant. The gap between what we can demonstrate and what we can understand is not shrinking so much as it is becoming more precisely defined, which is how good science works, but which can feel, from the outside, like the mystery is deepening rather than resolving. That feeling is not entirely wrong. The underground spaces of prehistoric Europe are genuinely mysterious in the careful, rigorous sense, not because they point toward hidden civilizations, but because they represent forms of intentional human behavior whose logic we cannot fully reconstruct from the physical traces that remain. The myths layered on top of them are vivid and occasionally entertaining, but they close questions rather than open them. And the questions, it turns out, are where the real interest lives. So after all of this, the surveys and the sonar, the acoustic studies and the micromorphology, the careful excavations and the comparative analyses, what actually remains unresolved? What are the questions that serious researchers, working with the best available methods, cannot yet answer? The list is longer than you might expect, and more interesting. Start with purpose. For almost every category of underground structure we've examined, the functional explanation remains contested, partial, or deliberately hedged by the researchers who know these sites best. The Erdstalls do not yield clear evidence for storage, habitation, defense, or ritual in proportions that allow confident conclusions. The Hypogeum's deepest chambers suggest ceremonial use, but the specific nature of that ceremony, who participated, what it meant, how often it happened, who was excluded, remains genuinely unknown. The Souterrains of Atlantic Europe were clearly used for something, and the cold storage explanation has real supporting evidence, but it does not account for all of the architectural choices made in their construction, the care taken with entrance passages, the deliberate narrowing that makes some of them difficult to move through quickly. Purpose, across site after site, is something researchers are still working toward rather than something they have established. Then there's chronology, which sounds like a solvable problem and sometimes is, but less often than you'd hope. Radiocarbon dating works well when organic material is present and has not been disturbed. At many underground sites, the very characteristics that made them useful over long periods, their stability, their consistent temperature, their enclosure, also made them attractive for reuse across generations, across centuries, sometimes across millennia. Material from different periods becomes mixed. An Erdstall might contain objects from multiple eras without making it clear when the passage itself was dug. A Domus de Janas might have been carved during one cultural period and reopened during another, with both uses leaving traces that are difficult to separate. The result is that even when we can date material found in a site, we're often not certain whether that material reflects the original purpose or a completely different use by people who encountered an existing structure and decided it was useful for something their predecessors never intended. This connects to one of the more significant unresolved questions across the field, the problem of reinterpretation. Human communities regularly encounter structures built by earlier people and assign them new meanings, new functions, new symbolic roles in their own worldview. A passage grave built to house the dead might be understood by people 500 years later as a dwelling of spirits rather than ancestors, a subtle but meaningful distinction that would change how they used the space and what they left behind in it. A storage chamber dug during one period of social organization might become a ritual space during a period of different social structure, or a hiding place during a period of conflict, or a sacred ruin during a period when its original function had been entirely forgotten. The physical evidence of these successive uses can layer in ways that resist clean separation, and the interpretive problem is not just that we lack information, it is that the site itself reflects multiple overlapping histories that the people involved may not have always been consciously aware of. There is also the question of regional connection, which needs to be stated carefully to avoid falling back into the unfounded unified system claims we've already examined. The question is not whether these underground traditions were secretly linked through some pan-European network. They almost certainly were not, and the evidence does not support that. The question is more nuanced. When similar architectural solutions appear independently across geographically distant regions, similar passage orientations, similar chamber proportions, similar entrance arrangements, what does that similarity mean? Some of it is almost certainly parallel invention, the same practical constraints producing the same practical solutions. But some of it may reflect something more interesting, convergent cognitive or symbolic responses to the act of going underground, responses that emerge from shared aspects of human experience rather than from cultural contact. If descent into the earth carries symbolic weight for communities across Europe, and the mythological record suggests it does, consistently, then underground architecture built to engage with that symbolism might share features not because the builders communicated with each other, but because they were working from something like common psychological material. Whether that explanation holds, and how much explanatory weight it can carry, remains actively debated. What makes all of this harder is that the social meaning of these spaces, not just what they were for, but what they meant to the communities that built and used them, is exactly the kind of information that material evidence is worst at preserving. Archaeology is very good at telling you that something happened in a space. It is considerably less good at telling you what people thought about it, what narratives surrounded it, what emotional or spiritual register they operated in when they entered. The bones in the Hypogeum tell us that this was a place of the dead. They do not tell us whether the dead were feared, revered, consulted or mourned, or all of those things at different times by different people. The oracle whole, if that is what it is, tells us that sound was important in that space. It does not tell us whose voice was meant to travel through it, or what the people listening were hoping to hear. And then there is the scale question, not the scale of a single site, but the accumulated scale of what these traditions represent. Hundreds of Erdtstalls across a concentrated region. Thousands of Domus de Janas across Sardinia. Souterrains distributed across Atlantic Europe in numbers that suggest not occasional eccentric choices, but a systematic, widespread, culturally embedded practice of going underground. What does it mean that so many communities across so much time kept returning to the idea of building beneath the surface? What does it say about how they understood the relationship between above-ground life and whatever they imagined existed, or could be accessed, or needed to be protected, below? The patterns are real. Their meaning is not resolved. What emerges from all of this is not a clean answer, but a refined set of questions, and that is actually where the field currently lives. Researchers working on these sites are not concealing a solution. They are doing the painstaking work of narrowing the space of what's plausible, ruling out the explanations that evidence contradicts, and building the kind of careful, provisional picture that good archaeology produces, one that is always subject to revision when new data arrives, which it keeps doing as new sites are found, new dating techniques applied, new analytical methods developed. What historians cannot explain in the end is not one thing but a constellation of connected uncertainties. Why these spaces took the specific forms they did, what they meant to the people who made them, how function shifted across the centuries, and what the recurring human compulsion to build beneath the earth actually tells us about the minds that built it. These are not failures of the discipline. They are the shape of the problem, genuinely complex, genuinely open, and genuinely worth sitting with, rather than resolving too quickly into answers that feel satisfying but close off the real questions before they've been properly asked. There is something that resists easy explanation about the fact that we keep coming back to this question. Not just historians and archaeologists, but all of us whenever we encounter these spaces. Why did they go down there? Why did they spend enormous effort carving into rock, shoring up earthen walls, constructing narrow passages that required you to crawl, to slow down, to leave the surface world behind? The question feels almost personal, because whatever drove prehistoric Europeans underground was not an aberration. It was a recurring, deeply felt impulse that stretched across thousands of years and thousands of miles. And the honest answer, as we've seen, is that there was never just one reason. For some communities, the motivation was survival in the most immediate sense, keeping food cold, storing grain through winter, preserving resources against seasons of scarcity. The Earth itself is a technology, and people who understood its thermal properties used them. For others, the underground was chosen precisely because it was hidden, a place where vulnerable people or valuable things could disappear from view, where entrances could be blocked, where the surface world and its dangers could be kept at a distance. These are the explanations that ask the least of us, and they are probably correct for a meaningful portion of the sites we've discussed. But they are not correct for all of them, and the diversity of these underground traditions is itself one of the most important things the evidence tells us. The Hypogeum of Ħal Saflieni was not built for storage. The Domus de Janas of Sardinia were not built for shelter. The passage graves of Orkney and the Atlantic facade were not built because their creators lacked the skill to work above ground. These spaces demanded extraordinary investment in labour, in time, in cultural attention, and that investment signals that something more than practical necessity was at work. Ritual was happening in these places. Identity was being constructed and reinforced. Communities were using the act of descent to create controlled experiences that surface life could not replicate, journeys through darkness that carried meaning precisely because of what they asked of the person making them. What these spaces collectively reveal, when you look at them across the full sweep of prehistoric Europe, is something like a map of human concern. Fear appears in them, fear of the dead, fear of winter, fear of enemies, fear of whatever existed in the dark that needed to be placated or contained. Memory appears in them, bones carefully arranged, ancestors installed in the earth, the past made physically present in a way that could be returned to. Belief appears in them, in the alignment of passages towards solstice light, in the acoustic properties that were either noticed or deliberately engineered, in the symbolic architecture of descent and return that mirrors the mythological vocabularies of cultures around the world. And adaptation appears in them, communities responding to specific landscapes, specific pressures, specific social structures by doing what humans have always done, which is to reshape their environment to fit the shape of their needs. The diversity of sites almost certainly rules out any single explanation. That is not a frustrating conclusion. It is an informative one. It tells us that the compulsion to go underground was not the product of one cultural moment or one specific problem being solved. It was a recurring human response to recurring human needs that took different forms in different places, but kept returning, generation after generation, because the earth beneath the surface kept offering something that the surface could not. Privacy, cold, silence, darkness, a sense of threshold, of crossing from one kind of space into another. Whatever that offered, people found it worth building for. And the questions that remain open are not incidental to these places. They are part of what makes them historically important. A fully explained site is, in some sense, a closed one. It has been accounted for, filed away, understood. But a site that still resists, that still produces debate among specialists, that still refuses to yield its function or its meaning to the best available methods, remains alive in a way that demands continued attention. The Erdstalls are still being mapped. The Hypogeum is still being studied acoustically. New Domus de Janas are still being documented, These traditions are not finished problems. They are ongoing conversations between the present and a past that has not yet said everything it has to say. What we are left with, ultimately, is not ignorance but a kind of informed wonder. We know more about these spaces than any previous generation. We have better tools, better methods, better comparative frameworks. And the more we learn, the more precisely we can identify what we still don't understand, which is itself a form of progress, even if it does not feel like resolution. Prehistoric Europeans went underground for reasons that were practical and sacred, communal and individual, driven by fear and animated by belief. They built in the dark with extraordinary care. They left spaces that have outlasted every other trace of their existence. And in doing so, they left us with something more valuable than an answer. They left us with a question that keeps pulling us downward into the earth after them.